If you're one of these lonely men that you're talking about in particular, younger men, and you're not going on dates really, you're not communicating with people in the real world, then when you have a figure like Donald Trump that comes up and says, well, your problem is all, these whatever progressive elites in Los Angeles, or your problem is like the Haitians in Springfield, like the problem is these fucking people that annoy you on the internet, like you're much more open to all of their critiques, no matter what their validity is, it seems. Hello and welcome to the Bulwark Podcast. I'm your host, Tim Miller. He's a staff writer at The Atlantic, author of the Work in Progress newsletter, host of one of my favorite pods, Plain English. You can go subscribe to that now. And he's got an upcoming book with Ezra Klein called Abundance. You can pre-order now. Maybe we'll have a three-way. That was unintentional when that book comes out, but you never know. It's Derek Thompson. How you doing, brother?
Tim, what a generous open. Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Brother, I don't blow smoke, and so it's a generous intro because it's true. It's a great pod, but we got a lot to get to. You have a cover story that we're here to talk about in The Atlantic magazine about solitude, and so I want to spend a bunch of time on that and then a few other things you've been writing about lately. I had this exclamation point in my notes as I was reading it. You wrote, studies show Americans spent even more time alone in 2023 than they did in 2021 when we didn't even have the vaccine all of 2021. We were forcibly at home in 2021, many of us, for at least a few months. That is a pretty alarming stat in an article that is filled with alarming stats. So talk to us just about the biggest picture trajectory and what you are reporting on.
The big picture here is that this is a long article that really pivots around one simple statistic, just one fact. And that fact is that Americans spend more time alone and less time in face-to-face socializing than we ever have, going back at least 60 years in official government data, and maybe going back 100, 150 years, given how social the first half of the 20th century was. We have never in our lifetime spent this much time alone and this little time socializing with other people. And I think that statistic needed an anchoring. It needed a naming. It needed a big picture treatment, because the way we spend our minutes is the way we spend our lives. And if we're spending our minutes alone, well, that has huge implications for the economy. We can talk about that. For our politics, I hope we talk about that. And really for our personalities. I think that our personalities change when we spend less and less time around other people with every passing year. So the most important fact in the article is that, according to a famous book by Robert Putnam called Bowling Alone, between the 1960s and the 1990s, Americans participated in associations and clubs, bowling leagues and union clubs, less and less and less. And when the book came out in 2000, it caused a huge debate. Was Robert Putnam just lying with statistics? Did he have this all wrong? Was America really at the beginning of a golden age of hanging out? But in the last 20 years, socializing has declined another 20% for all Americans, and more than 40%, or roughly 40%, for teenagers and the poorest Americans. We're in a social depression, and it has enormous implications, I think, for just about every station of human life.
Yeah, I look at that Putnam book, Bowling Alone, and Postman, Amusing Ourselves to Death.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you go back and look at the years, it's like, wait, Postman wrote Amusing Ourselves to Death in 1985 when there are only 3 networked news channels.
Fox News didn't exist. Yeah.
Right. I mean, barely. Was Rush even on in 85? Just the whole thing is crazy. No Howard Stern yet, or very proto. And then this, in 2000, just like the dramatic change. You didn't feel it in 2000, I guess, right? At least I was in high school in 2000, and I did not, there wasn't this sense that this was a big problem. I think living day-to-day lives for most people, but the trajectory was happening, and the observation, not to undermine the value of your article, but it feels almost like mundane now. Like, the interesting thing about your article is just like it's maybe even more dramatic than we realize, like living through it.
And I really wanted this piece to be very specific about the thing I was talking about. So Robert Putnam was famous, and in some quarters controversial, for talking about a concept that he called social capital. So the idea was that people have literal capital. They have financial capital, where you can just look at someone's W-2 or tax returns and you can say, all right, well, Michael is rich and Nathan is poor. But there's also something that you can call social capital? Are you rich in relationships? Are you rich in friendship? Are you rich in the kind of community networks that you live in? And that's what Putnam was really scrutinizing, is social capital for Americans declining? Can we say that social capital is declining for America the same way that we could say in a recession that income is declining for America? I'm trying to identify and pinpoint an even more specific and objective statistic. The American Time Use Survey, which is run by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, is a government survey that every year asks Americans, how much time do you spend doing all the stuff you do? How much time do you spend eating dinner? How much time do you spend sleeping? How much time do you spend filling out greeting cards? And they also ask, how much time do you spend alone? And how much time do you spend in face-to-face socializing? And those numbers are at their respective historic points, right? We've never spent so little time socializing face-to-face. We've never spent so much time alone. So what I felt I had here was an absolutely objective fact that I wanted to sort of dig into. What else can I discover that's truly historic about this moment? And I mean, Tim, the statistics are just unbelievable. I mean, the amount, for example, that people spend hosting dinner parties, for example, has declined by 30% in the last 20 years. I mean, it's just remarkable.
I wrote this note down because that 30% in the last 20 years feels like a lot. But when Putnam wrote his book, it had declined 45% already from the 70s to 2000, right? So it declined an additional 32% on top of that. It's not even close to Mad Men era as far as hosting people over for dinner parties.
Yeah, it's exactly right. It's an accumulating story. And there's a way to tell the story. You mentioned Postman and Putnam. There's a way to tell the story that's a technological story. And I don't think this is the only way to tell it, but I think it's a compelling way to tell it. Yeah. You say, the first half of the 20th century was really remarkably social. Marriage rates were up, fertility went up, union rates were up. The amount of time that people spent socializing between the early 1900s and about 1950 was just up across the board. What happened then in the 1960s, 1970s? And the technological answer is that first we got the car. And cars are wonderful. Our family has 2 cars, right? I'm not criticizing cars as a product, but one thing they allow you to do is to move away from other people. It allows people to move to the suburbs. They can privatize their leisure time, spend more time alone in their own backyards, less time around other people. Okay, maybe not a huge, enormous crisis, but then comes the television set. And when you add the car and the television set, then the following thing happens. Between the 1960s and 1990s, the average American adds about 6 hours of leisure time per week. We work a little bit less, which is awesome.
Think about leisure time you could do at that time.
So what could you do at that time? You could learn, a new language. You could read books. You could go out with friends more. You could watch more movies in movie theaters. You could learn how to play pickup basketball with your friends more.
What do we do instead?
We devoted basically all that time to TV. I think something like 90% of that time was spent just watching TV. It was almost as if we invented a technology that tapped into human beings' latent desire to become audience members, as if underneath everything that there is in a human being, at the very bottom of it is, we just want entertainment. I mean, I guess we're just going to keep plagiarizing Neil Postman here.
Yeah.
We just want to be entertained. And so the television just served this enormous need for the typical American to relax into their leisure time, to have sedentary rather than active leisure time. So you have this force of the car, followed by the force of the television set. And then in many ways, I think the digital revolution, for all of its wonders, and there are true wonders, many of them that it has, it made it even easier for us to select the conveniences of solitude. I could go out to dinner with friends, or let's be honest, I could order in. I could go out to a movie with friends, or let's be honest, I could watch Netflix. And there's nothing wrong with DoorDash, and there's nothing wrong with Netflix. But scaled over time and throughout the country, decision by decision, Americans are spending more and more of their time, and more of their choices are to privatize their leisure. And that's brought us to this point, this mountain of forces with the car, and then the television set, and then the digital revolution.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the costs of this, because you do write like there's some difference between solitude and loneliness. That doesn't, some people really enjoy solitude. It does, and this is maybe disaggregated somewhat from another trend that people have been watching, the epidemic of loneliness. Um, so what exactly are you positing are some of the problems? Let's actually just save the political part of this for the very end, because we can dedicate a bunch of time to that. But just the social problems.
Yeah. Let me break it into two.
Yeah.
And I'll start with a preamble. There's nothing wrong with people being introverted. I am introverted. There's nothing wrong with enjoying a moment's quiet. I love quiet time. I mean, I think I say in the article, I'm the father to a 17-month-old who is wonderful and extremely loud. So I know firsthand that there is nothing closer to heaven than a glass of wine at a hotel bar in a city that is not my home.
But you're a public in a hotel bar. What about a glass of wine alone in your hotel room?
There we go. Well, look, a glass of wine in a hotel room can be wonderful. I prefer the sort of the swirling bustle around me, like that sort of buzz of anonymity that comes with being alone drinking in a bar in a city that I don't live in. Like I find something lovely about that, but different strokes for different folks. And I do not want, and I really hope this comes across both in the essay and I can say it very explicitly here in the podcast. This is not the case against introversion. This is not the case against some solitude or the case against quiet. This is a realization of what happens when we lean too much into introversion, even agoraphobia, a refusal to leave our home, too much quiet, too much solitude. What if the dose goes up and up and up? It's the same with any therapeutic. Lots of drugs are good in short supply and very dangerous in large supply. So what are some of the bad things about this? Well, number one, researchers have found again and again that solitude does not correlate with life satisfaction. In fact, people who spend more time alone consistently say that they're less happy with their lives. This is partly because people who spend more time alone often tend to be lower income people, and income also seems to correlate with happiness. That's the first thing. Maybe the deeper and more complicated idea here is that I think that many people mistakenly seek too much solitude because they believe that it's good for them. So here's what I mean. There was a study that was done, one of my favorite studies in the piece, by Nick Epley, who's a psychologist at the University of Chicago. And he did this fascinating study where he asked commuter train passengers to make a prediction. How would they feel if they were asked to spend the ride talking to a stranger? And think to yourself, how would you feel? Well,
a lot
of people, F no. A lot of people said no, wait, quiet solitude is going to make for a much better commute than having a long chat with someone I don't know. They might not be interested in me. They might be awkward and weird. I don't want to do it. So we ran an experiment. And, some people were asked to keep to themselves and some people were instructed to talk to a stranger. And they were told the longer the conversation, the better. The deeper the conversation, the better. And afterward, people filled out a questionnaire. How did they feel? And despite this, strong assumption that the best commute is a silent one, two things were found. Number one, that people instructed to talk to strangers reported feeling significantly more positive than those that kept themselves. And maybe most importantly, that effect size was just as strong for introverts versus extroverts. And what Epley says, the title of this paper is called Mistakenly Seeking Solitude, is that many people, especially in an economy that allows us to keep to ourselves, assume that we'll be happier keeping to ourselves. But in a weird way, if we were forced by external forces, essentially, if we were forced to pretend as if we were a little bit more extroverted than we feel, we might be happier. And that might be the central social tragedy of our time, that we live in a world that allows us to pretend as if we are deep introverts, but we might be happier if external forces forced us to pretend as if we were a little bit more extroverted than came naturally.
All right, guys, it's it's a new year, and this happens to me every new year, where I'm like, I'm gonna cook more. I'm starting to cook more, less takeout. we're coming up with a plan. We're coming up with an agenda. I do really good in January, do pretty good in February, starts to go downhill in March. But I'm committed to it this year. We're going to be doing cooking at home, and especially on these busy weekday nights when you got the kids basketball practice or music practice, or I got a blab on MSNBC. It's important to get dinner done in a way that is super easy. And that's why I've turned to HelloFresh. HelloFresh's new ready-made meals go from the fridge to your fork in just 3 minutes. It's the same high-quality ingredients and restaurant-worthy flavor that you expect with just none of the work. Save valuable time with fewer trips to the grocery store thanks to HelloFresh Market. There's over 100 add-on items that you can add to your weekly box, like quick breakfast, packable snacks, beverages, and more. Luckily, my little baby girl is a pretty adventurous eater, so that's good. We've got some other folks, some other podcast co-hosts over the next level. JVL, it's a little tougher situation in that home. They got exact children with exacting standards on the meals. But across all of us, across Sarah and JVL and me, what we found is there are options at HelloFresh that work for our kids, make it easy for us to cook and do meal prep, and also, do prep for these podcasts. Listen to Derek Thompson's article in my earphones so that I can cook at the same time and ask engaging questions like I did today. It all works out. If you need to multitask, if you've got kids that are looking for a good meal, if you turn to HelloFresh. All right, guys, so here's the deal. You can get 10 free meals and a free high-protein item for life at HelloFresh.com/thebulwark10FM. 1 item per box with active subscription. Free meals applied as discount on the first box. New subscribers only. Get up to 10 free meals and a free high-protein item for life at HelloFresh.com/thebulwark10FM. I'm going to obsess over that study for a while because that's a great factoid about the train that everybody should follow. I'm an extrovert, and even I'm like, I wouldn't want to talk to a stranger on the train. but I can see, why the result would come out like that. I think it's actually there's an element of this that's even a little worse than what you're saying. Also, is that people think that they'll be happier being alone. But also with social media, particularly for a certain generation, like our age and younger in particular, people are getting what they think is social interaction without having real deep social interaction. And so, you gave an example in the article about a trend on TikTok of people like doing videos about how relieved they are when a friend cancels plans and how much engagement they get. I'm going to do a quick preamble myself because I don't want to be offensive. But I just, because there could be plenty of reasons for this, but one of the influencers that I follow is a person who has 50,000 followers or something on Instagram and like gets a ton of engagement online. And just this weekend, like right before I read your article, they posted from their wedding, and it was like they don't have any friends. Actually, it was like a small group. Now that could have been a lot of things. I go to, could have been money. It could have been, but it was like, no, the wedding had a photographer. It had a drone, it had like a lot of pictures of the couple, but like not a lot of reveling. And I just use that, not to pick on that person or whatever, but like, is it like all of these things, like we see all this, right? There are plenty of anecdotes of this, right? Of people that like, if it seems online like they're getting sociability, but they don't actually socialize in the real world.
I have 2 things to say about this. Okay. And I also found this part of reporting incredibly interesting. I have to give a shout out to my wife because I am basically not on TikTok. And while I was deep in the weeds reporting out this essay, she says, do you know about this trend where, these 20-somethings or teens will, celebrate in creative ways to music when a friend cancels plans, often because they're too tired or anxious to leave the house. And it's them like, wrapping themselves in a huge comfy blanket and being like, oh, thank God my plans are canceled. Again, just as with introversion, some sympathy is due here. Like we've all been in the position of having a dramatically overscheduled week. And then the friend cancels for Friday night and we're like, oh, Jesus, I wanted to get to bed by 9:30 p.m. This is fantastic. But the sheer number of these videos, I think, is a little bit alarming because this is, statistically, the most socially isolated generation in recorded history. And you see people responding to their isolation by celebrating not hanging out. Like, what is that about? And in the piece, I talk about how I think in many ways our smartphones have stunted our social development. But while I encourage people to read the piece, I actually want to work out a theory that's not in the piece, but that I've thought about more with you. As I'm reading a book called it's the big book about dopamine. I think it's called Dopamine Nation, but it's a book about the biochemical function of dopamine. And there's this thing where if you get a huge dopamine hit from something, you get a sort of blast of dopamine between your neurons. And then it lowers what's called the tonic level of dopamine, as if kind of like with a store. If everyone rushes to the store and buys all of the Pottery Barn couches, there's less in inventory, and so there's just less couches in the store. It can be the same with dopamine. A rush of dopamine can reduce the amount that's available to you. And I have the following biochemical theory of what our smartphones are doing to us that I'm just going to present to you, and maybe your biochemist listeners can tell me whether this is crazy or maybe on target. I think what's happening is something like this. I think people are sitting at home on couches and in bed, looking at TikTok or Instagram or Twitter, and dopamine is being flushed out of their system. They're going hit, 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 and they're putting their phones away. And rather than feeling rejuvenated by what is definitionally leisure time, they're actually dopaminergically exhausted. So when their friends say, "Hey, do you want to come out? Do you want to hang out with me?" They think, "No,
people all night.
Hell no. That requires an adventure into the unknown. I have to get dressed. I have to put on my makeup. I have to do my hair. I have to leave my house. I have to get in the car. I have to take the subway." That sounds like a bunch of potential misadventures. And I don't have what does dopamine do? Gives you drive. I don't have the available biochemical drive to hang out with you right now. So I'm going to say no. I'm actually going to feel great about saying no. And what am I going to do instead? Probably just hang out with my phone. So in a way, I worry that, and again, this is not fully tested, or maybe it is. I hope people can flush it out.
We do have some biochemist listeners, so I have one person in mind. I'm waiting for their comment.
So this is the hypothesis that I hope they respond to. I wonder if we are essentially donating our dopamine to our screens, donating dopamine to the parasocial relationships we have with people through our phone, and as a result, we have less drive to invest in the actual social relationships in our lives, that the dopamine is flowing toward parasociality rather than toward actual sociality.
Yeah, I never thought about it like this, but this kind of seems obviously true to me, right? That you, especially if you're and think about it from the social level of I'm just use TikTok or Instagram, particularly if you're a young person and you're scrolling through and it's like you're hearing about other people's drama. You're seeing people that are very pretty. That is making you maybe self-conscious or anxious, right? And you're spending time, and sometimes you're laughing, and there's some positive, right? But you finish the scroll. You're like, oh, I'm sick of this. After you spend 20 minutes or 40 or however many you spent just moving your thumb, and then that ends. It does. I don't feel like you need a biochemist to be like, yeah, it makes sense that they're like, what do I need now? Time away from people, right? Time away from people, not time with people. But they didn't actually get anything out of it. I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I'm being unempathetic. Like I'm such an extrovert and I love being around. And like, this is so obviously true for me. I'm open to feedback that my priors do not match other people's life experience. But the one thing I want to challenge you on that I just noticed when I was reading the article is there's a lot of conversation about teens and teen isolation. And I feel like it's weird, like in your world and kind of the social cultural analysis world, there are people that are like, teens are overscheduled. Like teens have too much stuff that they're doing. Like the high achieving teens, parents are obsessed with getting them into Ivy League schools, and so they're doing too many extracurriculars and they're doing too much homework, and they don't have enough time to be teens or kids. I don't understand how that social problem matches with the social problem of young people are spending too much time alone. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. I don't mean to keep saying to every prompt, I have two thoughts, but okay. I again have exactly two thoughts. The first thought is that we know for a fact that the amount of time that teens spend on their phones has gone from, definitionally about something close to zero 30 years ago to today about a third of their waking hour, right? So the typical person, teenager, adult, is consciously awake for about 1,000 minutes a day. It's kind of interesting. You can think to yourself, like every 10 minutes that you spend is therefore 1% of your waking day. And you can say, how do I want to spend the next percent? Well, over 300 minutes is how much the typical teen spends in front of a screen. So a third of their waking life. Just mathematically, it's inevitable that if teens are going to be spending a third of their waking life in front of a screen, the vast majority of that screen time is alone and often at home. And so they're not spending that time with friends in person. Some people could argue that that activity is social after a fashion, if they're texting with their friends or calling their friends. But you and I both know, and anyone who's a parent in this show knows, a lot of that time is really just spent, as you said, using the thumb to flick, 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 flick. The second thing I would say is that you've pointed out that children today, especially teenagers today, and especially teenagers of middle and upper middle and even upper class families are overscheduled under intensive parenting in order to burnish extracurriculars so that they can maximize their chances to get into a top 20 college. Those extracurricular activities are not necessarily, or often not entirely, social activities. If you ask teens, for example, as the Monitoring the Future study does, how much time do you spend actually going out with friends a week? Or what percent of, say, 12th graders go out with friends 2 or more times a week? In the 1980s, it was 75, 80% of boys and girls who were 17, 18 years old going out with friends 2 or more times a week. Now it's closer to 50%. From 80% to 50%, an absolute collapse in going out with friends. So it's possible that what you see as attention, and I acknowledge that parts of it might be attention, because if kids see their extracurricular activities as being highly social, well, then maybe you're just getting, you're killing 2 birds with 1 stone there. What you're actually seeing maybe is that intensive parenting is squeezing social time out of teenagers' lives because they are so highly pressured to think of the 1,000 minutes in every day as an exercise in maximizing their chance of getting into the best possible college, rather than thinking about some of those 1,000 minutes as being about social leisure time, spending time, whether it's sedentary, hanging out on the couch, or active, playing sports, with friends in a social fashion.
Yeah, you made a very good distinguishing point there, to a clarifying point on my question about, we're really talking about middle and upper income teen kids. You're talking about the helicopter parenting issue, right? Because you mentioned another issue in your article is that talking to low income teens and talking to parents of low income teens, the studies are showing that they see a problem of they don't have anywhere to go to socialize, right? That a lot of the rec centers and the stuff that, propped up in the middle of the 20th century, some of that stuff's still there, but it's hollowed out, and there just aren't as many options.
I'm really glad you brought that up. Eric Kleinenberg's a sociologist at New York University who's been incredibly influential broadly, but specifically to me, and I leaned on him a lot for this article. And he made a point that I think is so, so important, that as much as people like me want to focus on changes to the, let's call it, internal world of screens and television and smartphones and dopamine dumping toward TikTok, a lot of this is about changes to the external world. It's about changes to the physical world. This is a theme of the book that I wrote with Ezra to a certain extent, but America built a lot of social infrastructure in the first half of the 20th century, not only through the New Deal, but also up through the 1950s. We didn't just build roads and bridges. We built a lot of libraries. We built a lot of rec centers. We built a lot of community centers. We built physical places for people to go when they left their homes and weren't at work. And sometimes these are sometimes clichédly called third places, but it can be useful to think of that sort of third place outside of your 1 home and 2 office. We don't build these places anymore, especially in low income areas. And Eric's written a lovely book, Palaces for the People, about this precise phenomenon, that America in particular has really gotten out of the habit of building public physical places for people to spend time in when they can't afford to spend time in multi-million-dollar homes and multi-million-dollar schools and multi-million-dollar something else. And so it is really important to remember that these trends are worse for low-income Americans, even though the fears of too much solitude sometimes seem like an upper middle class complaint. In a weird way, this is a lower middle and lower class problem first and foremost. It is poor men and poor single men in particular, poor young single men in particular, who have the fastest growing rise in pure aloneness and solitude these days.
Right. That takes us nicely into the politics. I do say, having had this conversation, I feel like we were remiss to not have my colleague JVL here as a just antisocial crank lover of his private time. He does have a lot of kids, so maybe that solves the solitude problem. But I'm maybe sending him a homework assignment for the newsletter to give the contrary, not the non-extrovert view on all this. But the practicing of politics alone, and some of this I do think is related to what we've seen from younger men in their engagement in politics online. You write about how what this leads to, there's an obvious element, which is demonizing and alienating other people because you don't encounter them, so you don't understand the nuances of their views as much. It also, maybe for a different class of people, leads people to be out of touch with people on of differing views because they don't encounter them. And you also say it kind of leads to a nihilism. So talk about how you're connecting the increased solitude to our political moment.
So Mark Dunkelman, who's a wonderful writer and researcher at Brown University, has this really lovely schema where he says that, ironically, this era of social isolation has actually deepened our relationships in two specific ways. In the so-called inner ring of family and friends, we were just talking about intensive parenting. Intensive parenting is, to a certain extent, kind of extremely social if you consider sociality, spending time with your kids and obsessing with your partner over how your kids should spend their time. We're much closer to our family, spend more time with our families than we used to. That's the inner ring. And then there's a far outer ring that I think of as sort of tribe. It's easier for you. You're a Nuggets fan, is that right?
I am, yes.
Okay.
But
it's easier for you. Right. It's easier for you to follow other Nuggets fans. Oh, yeah. It's easier for you to contact reporters in Denver to ask, what can the team do in order to build more talent around Jokic, who's just this generational star. You can follow the sport and follow people who share your ideological preferences in a dozen other ways, or your aesthetic preferences. I don't know what kind of music you like, but I'll bet it's easier for you to follow people who listen to your type of music in a way you never could 40 or 50 years ago, right? Like you could DM writers at The Athletic to be like, I think you should write this about Jokic. Yeah. These are relationships that weren't possible 50 years ago. So where does that leave us? Where the inner ring of sociality for many people is stronger, that is close family, and the outer ring of sociality is stronger, of tribe. Well, it means that what's atrophying is the middle ring. And the middle ring, if we call the inner ring family and the outer ring tribe, that middle ring is village. We know our neighbors less. We know our cities less. We know the people who live around us less. And one reason why I think that matters a lot for politics is that being around people who aren't our family and don't share all of our ideological preferences like our echo chambers do, being around people that are around us but different, I think is a naturally moderating instinct. It allows us to see people who are different than us as human and reasonable and having their own set of interests, and sometimes even sharing our own interests, recognizing that the person who's voting for a candidate you consider heinous actually shares many of your key priorities. That's moderating. And in a world without that cooling agent, you get people like Donald Trump, who I think is a classic all-tribe, no-village avatar. And I also think that, as long as we're just trying to diagnose evenly across the board, I think that you have some progressives who struggle to see how half the country could like Donald Trump in the first place when their neighbors, in many cases, are voting for Donald Trump. People can say, no, well, Derek, there's this theory of the big sort. We tend to live around people who agree with us about everything. Well, a third of Brooklyn voted for Donald Trump, right? In a room of 18 people, 6 of them voted for Donald Trump in Brooklyn. So I do think that like the cold medicine that I do have for progressives like me or liberals like me is that if we feel like we're living in a country that's alien to us, when half the country, roughly speaking, every 4 years votes for this guy, maybe it's because we have made ourselves strangers in our own land.
Yeah.
And maybe we should try to reach out and understand people who seem like ideological aliens to us.
I agree with that admonishment to some progressives, but like on the Trump part, because and this type of figure could emerge on the left. Who knows? I think it just the solitude obviously lends people to be more likely to be susceptible to demagogues, right, and to people that lie about and demean your the people of the opposite tribe, right? I mean, people are always like, humans are wired like this. We are tribal beings, so we're susceptible to this regardless. But you are particularly susceptible to something that you're already biologically susceptible to if you are not doing anything to offset it in the real world, right? If you're one of these lonely men that you're talking about in particular, younger men, and you're not going on dates, really, you're not communicating with people in the real world, then when you have a figure like Donald Trump that comes up and says, well, your problem is all these whatever progressive elites in Los Angeles, or your problem is like the Haitians in Springfield, like the problem is these fucking people that annoy you on the internet, like you're much more open to all of their critiques, no matter what their validity is, it seems.
So many thoughts came to mind as you were saying that, which I agree so much with. Let me try to rank them in my head.
All right.
Arlie Russell Hochschild, who's a sociologist, I believe, at UCLA. I don't know if you've spoken to her.
Yeah.
She wrote a great book called Strangers in Their Own Land, and she just wrote another one. I think it was Stolen Valor, I think is what it's called. And I was emailing with her for this essay. And her comments did not make it into the final draft. But I'll tell you this right now. She said that in a lot of the homes, a lot of the mobile homes that she was visiting in these deep red areas in rural Kentucky, a couple of things were true. Number one, the largest piece of furniture was the television set. People were spending a ton of time in front of Fox News, and they were spending less time outside of their homes. And that had an interesting effect, where among this group, one of the most important issues to them was fears of migrants. But if you look at census data, one of the areas with the lowest share of immigrants in America is rural Kentucky. So people living in villages, people living in cities and rural towns that had the lowest share of immigrants thought that the most important problem facing this country was immigration. That to me is at least a suggestive sign of a world where people aren't prioritizing the issues in their so-called village, that middle ring, because the middle ring is atrophied. What they're prioritizing is the outer ring of tribe. The national political becomes the local story, right? The classic, all politics is local. No, all politics is focal. All politics is whatever Fox News or Ben Shapiro or whatever can get you to pay attention to that is a national storyline. That's politics today in the age of the internet. The other point that I want to make, and you on-ramped me to this, is that there's a Danish political scientist named Michael Bang-Petersen who's found that among people who are socially isolated, they tend to become more nihilistic, and they adopt a political attitude that he calls the need for chaos. These are people who have lost faith in the political process entirely, and they're disconnected from the knotty and complex politics and processes of the world around them.
Right.
And so
if you're not involved in your community, then you don't know how this stuff gets hashed out.
And so they tend to be much more likely to agree with pronouncements like, I need chaos all around me.
Yeah.
When I think about our political and social institutions, I cannot help thinking, just let them all burn. They tend to see politics as a kind of at an arm's length distant show, right? A kind of postman-esque reality show that affects their lives, but is also in some way bigger than their lives. It's a story for them to participate in more than a set of policies that can affect their day-to-day experience. And as a result, what they demand is entertainment. What they demand is chaos. And that to me is absolutely scary.
Uplifting stuff. We've got AI coming too, which is great. I don't have time to get to that right now, so people can imagine what they think the impact of AI is going to be on this solitude, the increasing trend towards solitude. I just want to do quick rapid fire on a couple of your other articles because there's some good stuff there, and this isn't really rapid, isn't really right in up your alley, Derek. But I'm trying to challenge you a little bit. We can all grow. You wrote about the most important breakthroughs of 2024. You write this every year. It's one of my favorite articles. What was the most important breakthrough to you of 2024, scientific or otherwise?
Let me challenge myself to be relatively brisk for these, which is rather than write small essays over audio. The most important breakthrough is a kind of half vaccine that's been developed for HIV. HIV kills hundreds of thousands of people a year. Tens of millions of people around the world suffer from HIV. We haven't developed a vaccine for HIV, but we've developed a shot that people can take twice a year that seems to protect them 98 to 100% from HIV. I mean, that's very close to what we have with the COVID shots. We call those vaccines, which I of course think we should. It's extraordinary that we've developed this drug. And if we can scale it like we scaled the COVID vaccines, it's possible that we really could take a dent out of this disease that's killed millions and millions of people. So, I think the news is biased toward negativity. And I like writing this article because it forces us to see the positive. And this is an amazing, amazing therapeutic.
You wrote another article called How Trump Won Everywhere. This might be harder to be brisk with, but we'll try to be as brisk as we can. There was Michael Podozer is insightful guy that writes about trends, political trends, and data. And he wrote something that I uncharacteristically disagreed with recently. Was that like his he thought that it was a lack of turnout among Democratic groups that was the core reason why Harris lost. I don't. I mean, maybe I can have a longer conversation with him. I don't mean to have him catch a stray on the pod here, but I more disagree. I more agree with a different view, which was yours, which was about how Trump won everywhere, and it was this small movement towards him as a result of some of the post-COVID environment. So why don't you try to sum up your case?
Well, yeah. First on whether it was people pulling out of voting entirely versus being persuaded, the numbers are still coming in. But just looking at Wikipedia right now, Trump received 74 million votes in 2020. He received 77 million votes in 2024. Harris received 75 million votes in 2024 versus Biden's 81 million. We're going to end up very, very close to where we were in terms of total votes cast. So I'm not as persuaded by the idea that this was about people not voting for Harris. I frankly think there were a lot of people who voted for Joe Biden who then voted for Donald Trump. And we should be curious then why that happened. And this clearly, I think, especially happened among people who were Hispanic, number one. And the swings among metro areas was absolutely extraordinary. I mean, just reading from the reporting that I did, this was back in November, in the New York metro area alone, Manhattan shifted 9 points right. Brooklyn shifted 12 points right. Queens shifted 21 points right. The Bronx shifted 22 points right. In Florida, Orlando and Miami and Houston and San Antonio and Dallas, all these places shifted about 10 points to the right. So did Wayne County, Detroit, Cook County, Chicago, all of them about 10 points to the right. This is not like a 10-point shift is not just about Biden folks sitting out. This is about people who wanted to vote for Donald Trump showing up. And I think people on the left and liberals need to look at liberal governance in liberal states and blue states and in blue cities to ask the question, why in the states that we run and in the cities that we run did Donald Trump move the electorate double-digit percentage points to the right? That's a big, big question.
Yeah, and I'm going to talk more with Liz here up next about all of the factors for these fires in LA, and there are many. So people just forgive us here. We're obviously going to gloss over some of this, but I do think that, you know, you can't look at what has happened in LA and not see it as another example where you have these kind of high tax, big government places that felt unprepared for the challenges that they faced. Now, this is just this massive challenge, and there's a bunch of like misinformation out there about like the fire hydrants ran out of water. It's like actually there wasn't enough water in the fire hydrants for all these different fires at the same time. But that said, like the mismanagement and the management failures are hard not to observe.
Yeah, and the truth is, I don't know exactly how to bake and slice the blame pie right now.
Sure.
I think that we're
and
in
I'm
a
not
moment.
Asking you to. I just mean
no, I take that. I mean, look, the pie will have to be baked and sliced. I mean, if these are policy errors, then we should know what they are so that we don't make them again. I mean, the West is not going to suddenly become like the Western U.S. is not going to turn into Brazil in the next 10 years, right? This is no forthcoming rainforest. It's going to get drier and drier and hotter, and pressure gradient differences between the Pacific Ocean and the inland California Nevada desert, which was what causes the Santa Ana winds, these factors aren't going away. So if we're going to live in nature, we ultimately have to live in nature, and that requires technology and it requires smart public policy. I think at the moment, there's probably a lot of conflation happening right now around how much of this is just the Santa Ana winds are an incredibly strong force of topographical fact. How much of this is the fact that there hadn't been a fire here for a long time, and so the so-called fuel, the vegetation and the housing simply created a lot of kindling? How much of this was the fact that California or Southern California had received an astonishingly low amount of rain, which again made the kindling perfect for fire? And then how much of this is a public policy failure, whether it's on the housing development side, the brush clearing side, or after the fact, because there's a lot of people angry right now about the insurance policies, which again, I think it's important, but insurance doesn't cause fire. So it's important to talk about what part of the blame pie we're looking at here. So there's a lot that we don't know, and a lot to disentangle on the cause front and then on the response front. And I really want people to be specific when they're describing the how and assigning blame. But there's no question that we're looking at an event right now. I have family that's dramatically affected by these fires. We're looking at an event right now that is going to, I don't think this is alarmist. I think it's going to reshape California for the next few years. I mean, if you have parts of that city where people are spending millions of dollars on homes and those homes are uninsurable, what's that going to do to the Palisades? What's that going to do to Malibu? What's it going to do to Pasadena? What's it going to do by ripple effect to other parts of Los Angeles and Southern California, and even parts of Northern California, if this state becomes uninsurable? These are huge, huge questions.